Well, good afternoon, everyone. We want to thank you all for joining us here. My name is Emma. I'm the Director of Platform and Marketing here at Glasswing. For those who know Glasswing and those who don't, just a brief background. Glasswing is an early stage venture capital firm dedicated to investing in enterprise, platform, and security startups that harness the power of AI and frontier technologies to transform markets and revolutionize industries.
My name is Jesse Bardo, and I lead the startup team for Silicon Valley Bank here in Boston. SVB is the financial institution behind 68% of US venture capital-backed tech and life science companies, with an IPO in 2020. I have the pleasure of working closely with Emma and Rudina at Glasswing, and I'm delighted to be here for a really important topic and one that I know all too well as a recovering founder. Today, we are excited to present Learning from Failure, Mapping a Path for Startup Success. Joining us, we have Rudina Seseri, founder and managing partner of Glasswing Ventures, and Tom Eisenmann, a Howard H. Stevenson professor of business administration at Harvard Business School and the faculty co-chair of the Arthur Rock Center for Entrepreneurship, to discuss Tom's latest book, Why Startups Fail. Welcome and thank you to Rudina and Tom.
And with that, I will hand the mic over to Rudina.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Jesse, and welcome, Tom. What a delight. I have to share with the broader audience that Tom was my professor at HBS. It has taken over a decade for me to still be comfortable to call him Tom and not Professor Eisenmann. So it takes a bit of effort. But Tom, I'm going to somewhat shift the tables on you and say that as you write a book about failure, if it was an easy book to write, everyone would be writing about failure. So there is a bit of an entrepreneur, risk taker, or not a bit, a lot of it in you. I'm going to write a book about failure and I'm going to be successful. So what was the impetus? You talk a little bit about what you thought the class would be like. And so get us started on that, on the emotional side somewhat, and I'm going to go for it.
All right. Well, first, thanks to Jesse and Emma and to Glasswing and Silicon Valley Bank for sponsoring, for hosting us. The working title of the book for a long time was False Start. It's actually one of the failure patterns discussed in the book, but the irony of that is I started working on the book in 2014, and I had many false starts. Sort of would outline it, make some progress, put it aside, and it finally came together. The motivation for the book does come back to that time frame, 2013, 14, and a team I'd worked closely with, former students who had launched a venture. I coached them on the startup idea. I was an investor in the company. They had what I thought was a great idea. They followed the minimum viable product approach, lean startup approach, in a textbook perfect way, exactly what we were at the time trying to teach at Harvard Business School and still trying to teach. And validated demand, raised $1 million, wanted to raise $1.5 million, and that is part of the failure story. The business only lasted a year. They actually had, consistent with validating demand, had good, strong sales and repeat purchases. They couldn't get operations together and hadn't demonstrated enough traction to either get a bridge from their existing investors or raise new capital, and failed. And I could point to a lot of reasons why, but I couldn't pinpoint the precise cause. So here I was, supposedly an expert on entrepreneurship. Failure happens, depending on how you define a startup and define a failure, maybe to 2/3 of venture capital backed startups. I was a failure at explaining failure. So that was disconcerting. Was I teaching the right things? And it set me on this quest to learn everything I could about were there patterns, recurring patterns, to speak to scores of failed founders and the investors who back them, do a lot of research, read everything else that had been published about failure. And the result is the book 7 years later.
So let's jump in, Tom. It's interesting because the tendency for all of us to level set is to say, please define failure. But I'm going to take that off the table. I'm going to say that we know how to define success. in that everybody benefits. And then we, rather than defining failure, we know we're not making enough money for somebody's unhappy, the investors, the founders, the employees, the customers, the other stakeholders. Somebody collectively really lost, if not all of them. In the book, though, what I find interesting, you talk about smart failures without quotation marks, or good failures, and not so much. Get us started on that.
Yeah. So when you write about startup failure, I mean, there's a whole class of failures that are neither good nor bad. They just happen, and they happen through no mistake on the part of the entrepreneur. Think of it as asteroid strike, right? You're a dinosaur hundreds of millions of years ago, and this giant asteroid wipes out the planet. Same thing happened with COVID. Hundreds of thousands of young businesses wiped out, and again, completely out of the control of the entrepreneur. Same thing happened with the Great Recession of 2009. So we can sort of set those aside. They're easy to explain. They're tragic. We can feel for the entrepreneur. And so really what we're interested in are startups that showed promise. I mean, there's also a set of businesses out there that were doomed from the start. And maybe only the founder sort of saw potential and they went at it, and they were ill-suited for the task, and the idea was terrible, and they just didn't listen to people. And the good news on those, they're tragic, but they fail quickly without raising a lot of capital or taking too much of anybody's time. So these hapless, hopeless ventures we can also set aside. The ones that are really interesting show some initial promise, but through some combination of mistakes by the founder and misfortunes, they don't work. Then, to your point about smart failure or good failure, there's a set of failures where the entrepreneur has a hypothesis, if we want to use sort of the terminology of science, a set of assumptions, and needs to test them, and goes out. And I mentioned minimum viable product before, in the cheapest but still rigorous way, without wasting any time, without wasting any money, finds a way to validate the assumption or fail to validate. And some businesses, the entrepreneur and the investors who back them have reasonable assumptions, and it just doesn't work. When you're an entrepreneur, you're doing something new, and by its nature, it's going to be risky, and sometimes the risk doesn't pan out. The key is just sort of recognizing that as quickly as possible without waste, and without sort of getting caught in the mental trap of sort of stubbornly persisting beyond the point where it makes sense to keep going. These are good failures. We should celebrate them, and VCs should back them all day long.
Yeah. So Tom, let's dig in a little bit deeper, and invariably we'll be talking about the companies in the book. The stage we invest in, sort of, it's the core founders, some developers, sometimes showered, sometimes unshowered, and then they're in the product development, and then they're about to launch in the market, right? So everybody's a generalist. It is a classic problem that we deal with, this challenge around the founder / early employees that are generalists versus specialization. And I cannot tell you how much I resonated with that topic in the book. And I mean, 15, 16 years of doing this, we still struggle, we still get it wrong. So let's talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Sure. One of the the book is divided into 3 parts. First part is early stage failure patterns. What are they? 3 of them. How to anticipate and avoid them. Then the second part of the book is late stage failure, later stage startups, say Series C and beyond, if you will. Again, 3 patterns and how to anticipate and avoid them. One of the early stage failure patterns I call good idea, bad bedfellows. Mm-hmm. So these are entrepreneurs who've got a good idea. This is the example I started with when you asked about the motivation for the book. The company is Quincy Apparel, and the founders had a concept for wardrobe for young professional women. The problem they had is they were tall and clothing didn't fit them well. So they wanted better fitting, affordable, and stylish. And you can kind of get 2 out of the 3. It's hard to get all 3. And it turns out that to your point about generalist and specialist, apparel design and manufacturing is a specialty where you need a lot of expertise to do it, and to recruit and manage a team that's going to do all that. Many specialized functions that all have to be coordinated carefully. Fabric sourcer, pattern maker, quality control, step by step. And these founders had a great idea, but no industry experience. They'd never designed or manufactured apparel. So they went off and hired specialists right from the start who could play these roles that I just mentioned. And the problem was they pulled them out of big apparel companies, big fashion companies, people who were not used to the chaotic rhythms of an early stage startup where everybody dives in to put out whatever fire is burning hottest. These people would quite literally sit on their hands and say, I'm the fabric sourcer. I don't know how to help with the pattern making. And so they really they hired for skill, not attitude. And often you need both, but they got the balance wrong. They went for investors. They made a mistake I think a lot of MBAs make. We lionize you, Rudina, and your ilk, venture capitalists. We sort of assume that anybody who's going to launch a business out of Harvard Business School should go raise venture capital. Right. And that's what, so these founders positioned their business as direct to consumer, which was just taking off at the time, sort of Warby Parker and Bonobos and so forth. And VCs got interested around that time in D2C. And so they raised from tech-oriented VCs who really didn't know that much about apparel manufacturing, who pushed for hypergrowth. That's what VCs are supposed to do, right? That's how you win as a VC. So get a fast-growing business. And apparel is a tricky business to grow fast, right? You've got to build inventory. If the inventory isn't synced with fashion trends, you're in trouble. So they had the wrong investors, the wrong team. You tend to outsource manufacturing in apparel to a third-party factory, especially when you're small. And those factories just ignored this team. They would push their orders to the back of the queue because Ann Taylor would come in with a big order that needed to be expedited. So our founders had no reputations or relationships, so there was not much they could do. So all together, sort of the whole constellation of players that need to contribute their time or their resources to the venture, they were deficient or dysfunctional on all fronts. And a lot of it can be traced back to the lack of industry expertise, the lack of domain experience of the founders. I've come through this research to have a real appreciation for how important that is in some ventures, but really not in others. I mean, I had the confidence to invest in Quincy because I'd invested successfully in Rent the Runway. Again, two HBS founders who didn't have fashion backgrounds. Turns out renting party dresses is or dresses is very different than actually designing and making them. So
in hindsight, 2020, you could say no kidding, because one has to produce, one is dealing with a tech-enabled business period. Somebody else dealt with that problem. But I looked at Quincy very, very closely, was concerned about lack of expertise, but I loved the founders. And sometimes the founders move mountains. You know, we talk about execution, and those two women could actually execute, domain expertise lacking notwithstanding. So then contrast that though with DotBub, I think it was, where they had, generalists and needed more specialization. Because what I'm trying to really get at, Tom, is as our companies grow, when is that right dynamic for the skill and the attitude to come together?
Yeah, DotBub is what is each of the chapters in the book is anchored by a case study, and DotBub is the anchor case for a late stage failure pattern that I call help wanted. And DotBub is an online retailer of home furnishings. So if anybody in the audience just looks around them, all this stuff was shipped from somewhere. The chair you're sitting on, the lamps, the couch, and so forth. And that's what they did. They sold home furnishings through a website. And there have been some disasters in this space. Fab.com, also in the book, lost hundreds of millions of dollars. One Kings Lane had a unicorn valuation and then was sold for something like 30 million. And DotBub actually mastered the demand generation formula. The founder, Anthony Suhu, came out of the television business, and he put the the ideas of television episodes to work in marketing the home furnishings. The chairs and tables and lamps would become characters in a sitcom, and it actually worked. People wanted to buy the whole room because of the way it was marketed. But Anthony, with a media background and some tech, lacked an understanding of integrated logistics. And it just turns out that shipping a couch from the West Coast, where they were, to Kansas is really, really, really hard. And first off, it had to come from Asia to the West Coast. That's hard too. And Anthony, knowing what he was doing, his first hire for vice president of operations. By the way, if that couch arrives 2 days early, unlike your Amazon books where you'd be delighted to get them 2 days early, the couch comes 2 days early, you have a big problem on your curb. Yeah. Because you're not there to get it into the house. So at least maybe different in COVID times. So Anthony's first hire for vice president of operations, he wanted a generalist who he could turn into his chief operating officer. And as it turned out, the person had no experience with integrated logistics. The second hire came from Netflix back in the days when they had the red envelopes stuffed with DVDs, and had experience shipping, those by literally the hundreds of thousands, but again, very different than a couch. And so it took, and the first generalist, COO type, bought the wrong ERP system, the system that you need to manage your inventory. So they had no idea what was in stock and out of stock. That generated a flurry of customer queries about where's my stuff, and they couldn't track the orders properly. And so the operations were not quite out of control, but really a whole bunch of diving catches and spending money to expedite orders and so forth. It took 3 tries to find the right specialist. And they finally found somebody who could put in the right information systems and manage the vendors and the shipping and so forth. And that probably killed the company. The company had great demand generation. That and the 1-2 punch, Rudina, of not having the right person in operations for a long time and burning cash faster than they should have. And then the e-commerce capital markets slammed shut in 2015. I mean, basically, Zulily had gone public and the stock crashed and some other things happened. And basically, investors just paused for months on end, basically saying, you got to figure out if people can make money in e-commerce, and we're not going to invest in anything. Good companies, bad companies, follow-on investments. And so just as DotBub was getting things under control and needed a Series C, there was no money out there. And basically, they were forced to liquidate.
So Tom, let's tie the thread. We have Quincy Apparel in the early days, too specialized. We have the furniture company and then Fab, because there are things that we can draw strings from that learning. If we put them in a straight line, sort of from immature to mature, maximum maturity, bringing some of the frameworks you talk about. I'm a founder. I have my 2 co-founders. I know one of them is not going to scale. I am torn between my loyalty to that him or her. I am dealing with the board members breathing down my neck. Here comes Rudina saying, show me growth, show me this, show me that. What do I do? And when do I do it? And what are the measures?
Yeah, no, so again, I think it comes down to understanding what kind of experience is really important and when. I mean, basically, once you start to scale, there's bound to be some functions where you need specialists, right? Your early adopters may come through word of mouth referrals, and if you can sort of manage some social media, you can sort of keep stoking that fire. Later on, if you have to turn to digital marketing, you're going to need a performance marketer. When you start to spend millions of dollars on Instagram ads and Facebook ads and Google ads, you need somebody who knows how to do that, how to buy efficiently, how to run experiments, run the A/B tests, and so forth. So for sure, a lot of functions are going to need specialists when they're scaling, and for sure that'll be disruptive because there will have been some generalist who is running that function up to that point, and that person's going to feel dislocated. They may have to leave the company. They may end up in a subordinate role. You get all sorts of old guard, new guard conflict. The specialists feel that their contributions aren't appreciated or understood. And they look at the old guard and say, "Hey, you seem to be sitting on stock options that are worth a lot. I'm just drawing a salary at this point."
Yeah.
and my options aren't worth anything yet. So all sorts of conflict. And then likewise, there's the question. So there's the question of functional expertise and then industry expertise. And I have to say, I don't have a food and beverage example in the book, but I've learned something about that over the years, and a lot more as I start to think through the lens of the work I've done on failure. Boy, is that a place where industry expertise is just pivotally crucial, right? When do you step on the gas and start to pay the slotting allowances, and how do you read the signals you're getting from the national chains about whether they're actually going to buy more of the product? And packaging, right? How do you design packaging in a way that actually appeals to the consumer? You know, tons and tons of small and large decisions that you can screw up if you're an entrepreneur who lacks the experience. So, I mean, unfortunately, there's no easy answer. As an early stage founder, are you in a sector where that industry experience is necessary? And when do you need the functional specialty?
So, Tom, if I bring this a little bit to a 30,000-foot level, Scott Matthews has a question along the same lines. When you are in I will call it seed A round startup, which behavior result is most important to the investors? And then as you evolve in growth, what changes? Is it growth? Is it innovation? I would love to bring in the LTV to CAC discussion. For context, though, Scott Matthews, I would call him one of my CEOs. He's a favorite. We brought him in to run CrowdTwist, which was a very successful exit ultimately to Oracle. But that's the context. So this is an entrepreneur/founder CEO. How do you think about that transition? We talked a little bit about, it's a blurry line at best between generalist and specialized, but then how do we think about that growth transition and what matters?
Yeah, A is vexing. And I've, again, through this work, come to have a new appreciation for how tricky Series A is. In theory, that's when you should achieve product market fit. It's a fuzzy concept. I think we all think we know what it means, but if we interviewed all the people on the call, we'd probably get many different definitions. Some would come back to Sean Ellis, sort of wanting 40% of the people sort of jumping up and down, screaming if you try to take the product away. And there is something to that. Obviously, that gets at engagement and so forth. The trick, I think, comes, so what the VCs really want is sort of signs of accelerating growth at that stage. And they want, if they're careful, they want some indication that the entrepreneur can see a path toward profitability. And by profitability, I mean an acceptable ratio between the value of the customer, lifetime value of the customer over the length of the relationship and the cost of acquiring that customer. We don't need to see a positive LTV CAC early on yet, but we need to have a concept for how we're going to get there. The problem that I've come to recognize is, and this comes through with the fab.com example in the book, is it's often the case at seed and Series A that you're still driving growth off of early adopters. And the early adopter pool can get saturated. And it's true that early adopters often have different needs than the needs of mainstream customers. If you're going to build a big business, a fast-growing, successful business, you obviously need the early adopters. They're going to get you going, but you almost always need mainstream beyond that. And if the mainstream needs are weaker than the early adopters or different than the early adopters, you can have your foot jammed on the accelerator trying to grow and find that the next wave of customers are much harder to get. You have to discount to attract them. They're not as interested in your features. You're not getting word of mouth referrals. They're not repurchasing with the same frequency. They're not staying around as long. And by the way, your early hypergrowth has probably attracted clones and competitors to the space. So there's some pressure, both on downward pressure on price, upward pressure on cost. So you're in an LTV CAC squeeze. Your customers are worth less and it's costing more. And the product market fit you thought you had with the early adopters, and indeed you had it with the early adopters, they loved what you were doing, dissipates. So the tricky thing about product market fit is you actually can lose it over time. And it's actually quite a natural dynamic for it to weaken over time as you try to expand beyond the sweet spot of the people who love your product the most.
So I'm going to parse that conversation into two pieces. I'm going to bring in Michael Donahue, who has asked a couple of questions, but I'll focus on your second question, Michael, which is sort of this focus on, there's a maniacal focus on customer acquisition, but then where does the retention piece come in? And what you just talked about is not all customers are created equal. In the Fab example, you had sort of the community that was really looking into the funky, highly curated pieces at first, and then that sort of, got weaker and weaker. You also have, this is not in your book, but I call it the leaky bucket problem. You see it in particularly with publishers, the big names, New York Times, Washington Post, where they acquire very effectively and they're paying attention to that. They're not paying attention that the bucket is leaking, at the bottom, so to speak. How do we think about the retention piece?
Yeah, so I mean, that's right at the center, and again, it's deceptive because your early adopters are probably going to stick around and come back and be enthusiastic, but you just have to do cohort analysis, and I think it's well understood, certainly in the SaaS business and in e-commerce, that you need to track the performance of cohorts very carefully, and that will tell you basically whether retention is starting to wobble with the more recent cohorts. My colleague Mark Robert, he's not the only one with this concept, but I think he's got a well-honed sense for it. Mark he's now a faculty member at Harvard Business School, but was one of the first employees at HubSpot and built the sales force at HubSpot. He talks about not only looking at retention through cohort analysis, but finding predictors, early behavioral predictors of retention. So at HubSpot, it turns out that their suite of tools has something like 25 different features. And they have determined that if you within a certain period of time, I forget what it is, 30 days or something like that, use 5 of the 25, you're much more likely to turn into a great loyal customer. So for all the entrepreneurs out there, if you can find those behavioral correlates with retention, it really gives you an early warning system, and you can come in and you can target those actions and try to stimulate them and turn an okay customer into a great customer. It's much better than, say, tracking Net Promoter Score, which is so late. I mean, it does precede attrition, which is the good news and lets you act, but a Net Promoter Score can be wobbly or flawed for any number of reasons. So you really haven't done anything to pinpoint the problem. Whereas these correlates with early engagement sort of leading to retention, I think can be very powerful tools. So to that end, we've sort of talked about the components that ultimately fit in the numerator, which is the LTV. Let's talk a little about the CAC. This is an ongoing discussion, and it's a pain of my existence because, again, we're investing in companies that are going to market and they've just launched. When is the CAC meaningful? I will tell you, like, I'm thinking of a particular portfolio company, and, if the founders are on, which I suspect they are, they'll be like, yes, that's us. We hired, I believe, 6 people on the sales team in one day. We could train them at the same time. They were learning as a cohort. It actually has been one of the most brilliant moves they've made so far anyway. And we loaded them on our CAC. Guess what? That's an ugly LTV to CAC ratio overnight because of one move. So it's not just sort of calculating the acquisition cost. It's actually, when do you load it? Is that the right time to load it? Or do you give them 3 months to be productive, so you're comparing apples to apples? Because you've loaded the cost, not captured the impact. Yeah. So again, through this work, I've come to appreciate how complicated CAC can be and how there are offsetting forces at work. So my advice would be start tracking it right from the start. You don't necessarily manage against it, but you need to monitor it. And I mean, a team is going to get better at the performance marketing, right? The CAC will come down as you sort of figure out what works and what doesn't. So that's one effect. The other effect, though, is as you try to grow, I mean, there are many marketing channels that they're like a reservoir that you can deplete, and maybe it'll replenish itself over time naturally, but you can only you can only do so many searches a day with the good keywords. And if you try to market through search engine marketing beyond that, you're going to go for peripheral words for customers who aren't as interested. So your CAC is inevitably going to rise when you saturate the marketing channels. There's also saturation of the customer pool itself, right? So as you sort of expand beyond the sweet spot to people who are less and less interested in your product, you're going to have to market harder to get them. And there's also competitor effects, right? As sort of people come into your space, they're going to bid up keywords, they're going to bid up some of the channels. So all of these things are forces that are sort of pushing CAC down. I mean, basically, over time, you should have brand equity, and that should make it cheaper to acquire customers. But there are these other forces that are pulling it up, and you just have to watch it like a hawk and track it, and really try to decompose. You know, if it's going in a direction you're not happy with, is it because we've saturated the target market of consumers? Is it because we're overusing certain marketing channels? Is it because our competitors are bidding up the cost? And you know, customers are still very good, but it's just more expensive because we're fighting over them.
Yeah. So along the same lines, in a number of instances, in the cases in the book, we had early successes. I mean, in some of them, we had unicorns, and they were real unicorns, and people paid real money, whether it is the Israeli company, I mean, real dollars that went behind that. Arbor Rucci from New York actually asked a question in our feed, basically said, if you have had early success and then, failure in lean startup lingo, does it mean that the market has been resegmented? Or was it a fake success? That's my addition. And then Vlad Sainoa, former CTO of Nuance, they did well by him, and now luckily for us, venture partner at Glasswing, asked, I think, a similar question, but at the 30,000 foot level, which says, insufficient market research, so he's starting with that premise, leads to false starts and false positive. Too much research, I'll say, who the heck has time for that when you're doing a startup, but can lead to paralysis analysis. And then in between, you're trying to hire and get the venture capitalist's attention and find a location or manage a remote team and build culture and get on front of the media. How do you balance these things? Is early success false? And how do you balance false starts with false positives?
Yeah, so early success is early success. Sometimes it comes from great salesmanship, great storytelling. So we can raise a big round without having proved much of anything, if we can dazzle the investors. So let's set that aside. We all understand what that is. Sometimes, as I said, you can have big success with the early adopters that can dissipate over time, and that's just something that as an entrepreneur, as an investor, you got to track. And the best we have the toolkit for tracking it. That's cohort analysis and tracking LTV, CAC, and so forth. This question of overanalyzing, I think it's real. I mean, I've spent 23 years coaching MBAs at Harvard Business School, and a problem with MBAs is they're trained to find fault, and many will just keep. I mean, you look at any startup, and there's no end of the problems you can identify, and some of those problems lend themselves to deeper and deeper analysis, and you sort of can get paralyzed by that. I think it's much more common for entrepreneurs to sort of swing the other way and assume they can see around corners. They've got the vision burning bright of the problem and solution they want to go after. This is the false start, where basically you skip the hard work, not very time consuming, by the way, of making sure you found a problem worth solving by talking to customers about unmet needs and exploring. There's always a range of solutions to those problems, and it's easy to assume that you've got the right one. I mean, entrepreneurs, what defines an entrepreneur? It's a bias for action. And so it feels like you're being a great entrepreneur if you just dive in and as fast as you can, build and sell. It actually feels like you're following lean startup logic, because what do we tell? We say, launch early and often, fail fast, get out there, get it in the hands of consumers, get feedback and iterate and pivot. You can do all those things, but if the first version of the product is more likely to fail because you skipped some upfront research before you started your engineering work, you've probably wasted 4 months. That's the amount of time it might take to actually build the thing, launch it, and see if it's working, and then figure out how you're going to pivot. You've basically sacrificed 4 months in order to avoid spending 4 weeks up front doing some upfront research with simpler prototypes and talking to customers. So I think entrepreneurs are much more vulnerable to the false start and than they are to analysis paralysis. But I think they're both real. And the false positive is just, there's a lot of human nature here, right? We get so turned on when you've had early success, and you have early success with the early adopters. You relate to them. If you're a good entrepreneur, you're close to your customer, you want to make them happy. And it is possible to sort of skew too far in the direction of the early adopters and accelerate in that direction, maybe come up with a feature set. They're often sophisticated power users with more advanced needs than the mainstream customer. So you can over-engineer your product. You can make a lot of mistakes.
And you talk about that in the book. You talk about that, how you talked about Dropbox, how they were actually, I think it was Dropbox and not Box, that they were late to market, but they really oversimplified the product and got ahead of everyone else. Am I mischaracterizing?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. Dropbox is intriguing. Drew Houston, it's fascinating. You can find his Y Combinator application online, and it's intriguing to read about it. So he recognizes that he needs the early adopters, that they are going to spread the word about the product. They're actually going to become unpaid customer support, which they did. Sort of, if you think about how your mother may have sort of set up her Dropbox account, it's by talking to the child who actually is a software engineer or something like that. And so he listened to this early group. He got feedback from them. They wanted all these advanced features. I mean, imagine software engineers sort of collaborating with each other, working with many different devices, sort of big files, sort of very complicated needs. Compared in his Y Combinator application, he actually talks about building a product that's so simple to use, my mother can use it to store her recipes. And he had the discipline. He made a calculated bet that creating something simple would still be so much better than what the software, what the early adopters were working with, that they would adopt it, which they did, and yet meet the needs for simplicity. There are other ways to skin that. I'm sorry, it's a terrible expression, to solve that problem. And you can build 2 versions of the product. It takes longer, or you can build the complicated one and then hide those features as you start to bring the mainstream on board. So there are lots of ways to do it. The point is, as an entrepreneur, know the difference between early adopters and mainstream, and have a strategy, have a roadmap for how you're going to meet both sets of needs.
So my partner, Rick Grinnell, was Rick your student as well, Tom? I think he was.
I think so.
Yeah.
After several thousand, the names and faces do blur a little.
No. You talked about network businesses. I took network businesses. But Rick raises another point, which I'm so glad he does, because it's another thing that we see in the portfolio across companies, which is marketing is not necessarily the immediate background that founders come with. They tend to be technical, in fact, especially for some of the sort of B2B businesses. And in this back and forth exchange that we've been having, and a lot of what the book focuses on rather implicitly and explicitly, is around how understanding marketing, analysis, segmenting, even the LTV to CAC discussion are critical. So Rick's question is, when is the right time for a company to bring in the marketing expertise at a senior level? Marketing is an afterthought. I mean, I'll add to that if Rick won't mind. I walk into a board meeting, I cannot tell you how much complaining there is by the founders themselves saying, and we need the sales engine, we don't have enough coverage. But then we say, let's build the marketing team, and that's the last thought that they want to have in the last expense. How do we balance?
Yeah. Sales can't scale, obviously, until they have leads, and marketing needs some time to figure out how to generate quality leads and how to qualify those leads and so forth. They're going to fight forever, right? For the end of time, marketing and sales will be fighting over the quality and quantity of leads that are being generated. I think pretty early. I had the pleasure. Not many people on the call will know who Ben Shapiro is, but he was a legendary marketing professor at Harvard Business School. He's retired a few years ago. But so I published a summary of a couple of the early stage failure patterns in Harvard Business Review recently. And Ben just wrote me a wonderful note. And it's like, you know, I mean, we're still all insecure enough, like when an idol says you did nice work, it was moving. But it basically said, like, I read your thing, I loved your thing. You think you're writing about entrepreneurship, but you're writing about marketing. Everything I read in here is about marketing. And he talks about his mentor, Ted Levitt, the truly legendary marketing professor, sort of getting angry when Ben was an MBA years and decades ago, getting angry with the class and sort of filling out one big blackboard in the front of the room with just the one word, customers. You know, it's all about, and Ben says that whatever it is, probably 50 years later, you know, he remembers that moment. And Ben said in this email, you know, I never met an entrepreneur, or for that matter, somebody in a big company who said, we've learned too much about our customers, you know, and a good marketer, someone with the right sensibility is going to bring that in. Obviously, it's important early on for the founders when they're still designing the product and searching for product market fit and pivoting to be in direct touch with the customers, you know, and especially around the sales function. So that's it, you know. But I think it takes a while to figure out which marketing channels are going to work. I mean, I find that entrepreneurs are often surprised. They sort of assume a channel is going to be productive and it turns out to not be, but something else works. And those things just have to be tested. So essentially, it's a bunch of experiments, and you need somebody who's been around that track before and knows the patterns and knows how to run those experiments. So I would bring the person in pretty early. They do need to be stage compliant, right? So if you bring in somebody that's too much a late stage person and they're confused about why is it so chaotic here in this Series A company, that might not work, or might be a waste of money and a poor fit.
One final question on this topic, and then we have a number of questions around evil VCs, board dynamics, so we'll move on to that. But Ken Morse, hello, Ken, the legendary Ken Morse out of MIT and beyond,
yeah.
Around, you know, what the book or some of the cases have in common is that the founders were lacking that deep 10 to 15 years of industry experience and didn't have the network of recruits of having done it before, in quotes. To what extent does the 3K rule hold here? And that's know the market, know the people in the market, and be well known in the market. And if I could tie to that, I often think when I evaluate companies, particularly of first-time founders or non-domain experts in a new space, I think about them as the disruptors, and then how do they attract the adopters? So different lingo, but I think on Ken's questions, what are our thoughts?
Yeah, so I would say, you know, there's 7 deep case studies in the book, and 2 of the 7 fit his did not have 10 to 15 years of industry experience profile. And the other 5 did. They're actually pretty, I mean, Steve Chambers, who he wasn't the founder of Jibo, but he was the CEO of Jibo. You can't ask for a deeper industry background. The founder of Dot and Bo was a serial entrepreneur. He'd been at in both startups, and then the startups he sold to big companies, you know, at least 15 years of experience. Shai Agassi at Better Place, you know, many years at SAP and at a startup he built before that. So yeah, I think it's right, but it's interesting. You know, the ones that fit the pattern Ken is concerned about, the Quincy founders absolutely suffered from lack of understanding of the apparel industry, and to Ken's point, a lack of relationships. You don't have a network risk with people, so you can't find the right people. And even when you do bring a candidate in, you don't know what you're looking for. So there are ways to compensate for that to some extent by having advisors, by having investors who can help, and by outsourcing the evaluation of skill to somebody who can assess the skill. You can still recruit for attitude yourself as the founder. The other venture, though, Sunil Nagaraj, was a dating site. dating turns out to be a place where you don't need, I mean, we all have some experience with dating, and you don't need a lot of industry experience to launch a winning, there've been many losers in that space, but some interesting winners. And if you sort the winners from the losers, it's not anything but the background of the founders or their prior market experience, industry experience, that sorts out the coffee and bagels and OK Cupids of the world from the losers.
So, Tom, let's talk about the combination of what kind of money do you raise, fast growth versus managing for profitability, but also how you evolve the board. So Laurent Gale is asking a question around, are the early board members, whatever that looks like, the same as what you need when the company enters a growth stage board? So Laurent, his company, Cast.ai, is basically optimizing your usage of cloud. Let's just put it at the highest level. So how do you manage your Kubernetes, and how do you bring down the cost to be as much on demand as possible? And they're leveraging rules-based AI. But how should he think about board evolution as the company evolves?
I mean, the company evolves, the need for specialists, the kinds of pressures they're going to encounter. I mean, little company that's doing something disruptive in a regulatory sense isn't going to attract much attention. When you get big, you need people that have sort of understand the policy linkages and so forth. So I would say, and just sort of all the dynamics of scaling the team, managing the culture, so many things, so many pressures and challenges are different in a scaling startup. And ideally, you've got board members who've seen it before, and can add value. So basically, an interesting question is whether your early stage founders, if they lack late stage experience, they may not be adding that much value anymore. What they probably do bring, which can be quite helpful, is a very strong relationship with the founders and an understanding of their strengths and weaknesses, and whether they can manage the very tricky transition from early stage to late stage and what roles they'll play in the company as the company evolves. So, I'd say, but it's going to be natural for your late stage investors to have the kind of expertise you need at late stage. So I think it happens more or less automatically if you bring in a new board member with a later and later round, that ought to be happening. What you will get is very tricky conflict between the early stage investors. And this comes up in some of the case studies in the book, where the early stage investor has such a low basis on their stock that they want the company to continue to be successful and grow, but what they really want is for the company to not screw it up. Whereas the late stage investor, if they're going to get a positive return on their investment, the thing has to still double or triple, which means lots of growth. It means entering Europe. It means launching a second product line. And so the board's collective tolerance for risk is going to get messy, and you'll see board conflict over how much risk to take as the company matures.
So let's take that complete picture and sort of pull out the different puzzle pieces. So you talked about the misalignment between founders and investors, but also within, you talk in the case of Quincy, I think it was Quincy Bedfellows, but also the misalignment between not all VCs are created equal. Forget personalities and backgrounds and value add or not, just what money are we managing and what risk have we taken and the reward. One piece around that is several times it comes up that the VCs were either losing faith or for the right and sometimes the wrong reasons were pushing the company toward an acquisition. There's a question by Lawrence to that end, like, could a VC be destroying a company effectively because they're pushing it in a certain way? Part B to that, so that's one question. Part B to that is, how many founders have you met, Tom? Give me a percentage that say, I am the initial founder. I know for a fact, I am aware of myself and I know my skill set, and I know for a fact I will not be the same in the CEO's seat when we are north of, humor me, 30 million.
Yeah, so we know that. We know the statistic, which is Noam Wasserman, my former colleague, did the research, and at Series D, only 40% of Series D companies are led by a founder CEO. The 60% have brought in a professional CEO at that point. So we know, and you know, sometimes those folks are forced out against their will. Sometimes they see, they feel it, right? They feel they no longer have the skill to sort of take the company to the next level. And Noam actually has interest in his book, Founder's Dilemmas. He has the data on the fraction. I forget the fraction. I think it's something like 1/3 step away voluntarily, or step into a new role, and 2/3 are essentially forced out by a board that now outnumbers them and can vote them out of the CEO role. So so what that says is I think there are many founders who are self-aware and sort of see and feel the challenges and how much they are beyond their capability. There are also some who frankly just love the rhythm of building something new, building something from scratch. And that's actually dangerous if that person wants to hang on to the CEO role, but wants to sort of relive over and over again the chaos of creation. Right. They're sort of Peter Pan principle. They don't want to grow up, and boy, if that person still controls the board and can't be voted out, you can have a real mess on your hands.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting, because if that person, there is a constant need for innovation and they are comfortable doing that, there's a role for them to play, or they need to be startup, an engine of startups, almost their own set of incubations that they bring in the professional management. I asked that question because it is not uncommon for VCs to get the bad rap of, you pushed out the founder. At Glasswing, we take the approach of there is always a role for the founder. It is not always a CEO role, but it's an inherent conflict because it requires self-awareness on the VC's part and on the founder's part, to be perfectly honest. Tom, at the end of the book, you write a letter, and I went over it at 11 p.m. last night. I needed it, having lived through the case studies. Tell us a little bit, and what is uplifting about failure? How do you get up the next morning in that void when it feels like part of you has died?
So it hurts, obviously. For months afterward, it's going to hurt. And the founder, I mean, you've trashed your personal relationships because you've been working so hard and not going to dinner with your friends, and your spouse is tired of hearing about it and maybe lost patience too. You may, depending on your family circumstances, have trashed, completely depleted your bank account, sort of be staring student loans in the face, et cetera, et cetera. So all that hurts. What can be good about it, and by the way, I created a companion course at Harvard Business School entirely devoted to entrepreneurial failure. And I worried quite a bit that I was going to just basically push it in the face of all these students and somehow scare off a generation of Harvard Business School students from being entrepreneurs. Now I'm in charge of a lot of the entrepreneurship programs at the school, and 5 years from now, there'd be this article that basically, there's been an alarming drop-off in entrepreneurship out of Harvard Business School, and we're looking for the cause, trying to figure it out in this Eisenmann's course. But it had just the opposite effect. The course, I actually survey the students at the end and ask them, are you more likely or less likely to become an entrepreneur over the next 5 years as a result of this course? 20% do say they're less likely, that basically they've stared it in the face and, excuse my language, just scared the living crap out of them. Yep. And they should know that. 40% said, I've seen it. Thank you for showing me that. But I think I can handle it. And I actually relish the challenge. So, so the course has sort of given them a more nuanced sense. And the remaining 40%, by the way, say, I was always going to do it. I'm still going to do it. I may do it later, and I may think twice about whether venture capital, sort of signing up for hypergrowth, is the way to go.
Business there, brother.
So yeah, sorry about that. You'll be fine. My MSMBAs are gonna be in your portfolio anyway, and I can't turn them away from entrepreneurship. So I think, and one of the reasons the students who are enthusiastic, I bring in the failed founders, and granted, it's a curated set of people who are quite thoughtful about the failure. many of whom got the self-confidence to come in and talk about it because they've gone on to do amazing things afterward. But it is quite true. I think of many founders out there who failed. If you fail gracefully, sort of responsibly, in ways that protect your relationships, pay people, vendors and employees who are owed money, get paid back. And if you show you can be thoughtful about your role in what happened and what you've learned from it and what you'll take into the next venture, these folks, I think, can bounce back stronger. It's the founder who remains in denial about what happened. It was everybody else's fault. Who I think is not the role model. So my students saw these fantastic role models, and they could see themselves in that role and see that, yeah, it hurts, but you can bounce back from it. And that, I think, is that's the silver lining. And those are going to be better entrepreneurs as a result.
Because they're going in, I think, eyes wide open. So I started our discussion with saying, you had your own big entrepreneurial moment with this book. You're writing about failure and expecting strong sales. I will tell you that as a VC, and Rick and myself have our own entrepreneurial journey. And literally throughout the book, I'm reliving some of the stories, but also constantly we're thinking about how are we doing this at Glasswing? Because it feels like long forgotten, but there was no Glasswing 6 years ago. So we're as much the medieval VCs, but we can also relate to the founders. So as we wrap this conversation, what would be one sentence, one parting thought that you leave us, whether it's on the success, on an incredible success that you're having around the book, whether it is that all of us are taking risks, entrepreneurial in many ways? What do we leave these founders as we wrap this lunch session?
Yeah, so it goes. I'll steal from the letter to a first-time founder that you mentioned at the end of the book, and it sort of talks about how some of the conventional wisdom on what makes a great entrepreneur, while very sound, be frugal, grow, be focused, be persistent. That's all good stuff, but taken to the extreme can actually get you into trouble. And sort of in that same spirit, entrepreneurs hear all the time to trust their gut, to trust their instincts, and they should. And it's an advantage. It allows them to move fast in a world where people have more resources. But there's a certain set of decisions where Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the psychology of decision-making, talks about fast thinking and slow thinking. You do want to slow down as an entrepreneur on some decisions, sleep on it 2 nights, talk to a lot of people, and don't trust your gut, because your gut is going to be racked by emotion on some of these big decisions you have to make. So understand when fast thinking is okay and when slow thinking is the right way to go.
Thank you, Tom. We're always learning and perpetual students of yours. Thank you on behalf of everyone. And thank you everyone who joined us today.
Yeah, thanks for listening, everybody. And to Silicon Valley Bank and to Glasswing, thank you for hosting.